We are ready to start panel 3, which is a deep dive with our MIT faculty, a couple of whom you have already met. We have Roberto Rigobon, who you have met. We have Valerie Karplus, who is Assistant Professor of Global Economics and Management at MIT Sloan, and she is the director of the Tsinghua MIT China Energy and Climate Project, which is a collaborative team of researchers from the US and China focused on China's role in the global energy markets and climate change mitigation. We were just chatting, Roberto has hit the 4 million mile mark, air miles, and we were discussing what that meant for a global footprint, a carbon footprint in terms of climate change mitigation. Then we have Yasheng Huang, who you have met earlier. And then we are joined by Don Lessard, who is the Epoch Foundation Professor of International Management Emeritus at the MIT Sloan School. His research interests are in global strategic management and project management, focused on the energy sector, with an emphasis on managing in the face of uncertainty and risk. Don is emeritus. He started at Sloan in 1973. And along the way, he served as deputy dean of the Sloan School. So maybe he and Yasheng can share thoughts of what it means to be in the dean suite. To get us started, Roberto, if you would.
What is the question? I am totally lost.
We were giving each of you a few minutes to frame discussion however you chose.
Okay, you have heard me a lot, so let me just, actually, you have heard me a lot say my opinions during the day, so let me just be very brief. And in fact, what I want to do is to summarize a little bit of what we have said. Times ahead are going to be difficult for Latin America, and the way to prepare ourselves to that is to become a little bit blunt on policy, move a little bit more towards the center in most countries, and start aggressive process of reforms. And I think that the reforms in each country are different, depending on their needs, but clearly, as Vittorio Corvo said this morning, is that we have to do the homework. It's very easy to succeed when all the stock prices go up. And when the stock prices increases by 20%, well, if I increase my portfolio by 20%, it's easy. It's difficult to actually prove yourself in bad times, and I think that that's what is going to happen to Latin America ahead. In terms of the relationship between Latin America and China, I think that it is quite important. I have learned a couple of lessons in the discussion today. I think it's quite important first for China to think differently about Latin America. I think that China has, in some sense, thought a lot about Brazil as if this is the partner that they want to enter a relationship. And to be honest, it is much broader than that. The whole Latin American region is big, and therefore there are opportunities everywhere. I think that Latin American countries, in order to increase that relationship, we have to be willing to be more open and willing to accept the involvement of China in our economies, and we have to increase our communications and our understanding so we develop the trust, the necessary trust for that to happen, and vice versa. So we have different cultures, but I think that we have an amazing opportunity here, and those are kind of the tidbits that I have learned throughout the day. Yeah, I want to do that at the end.
Thank you very much. This is probably the warmest welcome I could imagine to the MIT Sloan community, to be here with all of you talking about Latin America and China and the future of partnership between two very important regions. So today my remarks will focus on energy and climate change, taking us a little bit further afield from the direct conversation about economic growth. And the main point of my remarks is that really Latin America and China will face very different and potentially complementary challenges when it comes to managing their energy systems and addressing climate change and broader sustainability concerns. Now, it's probably no secret to any of you that China is the world's largest consumer of energy and emitter of carbon. The energy system in China is still very heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Over 65% of China's primary energy comes from coal, And much of this is used to power the nation's vast industrial sector, which accounts for 70% of that nation's energy end use. Natural gas, on the other hand, has started small. It's growing rapidly. It's reached about 6% of primary energy use today, and has recently started to displace coal use in the electricity and more and more the industrial sector as well. Oil, at about 18% of the total, is growing rapidly and is becoming increasingly comprised of imported sources. Another little known, perhaps, and potentially important fact about energy and emissions in China today is that much of China's emissions are actually not due to consumption inside China, but consumption of the goods that are exported from China. If you look at the contribution of China's net trade, so this is emissions embodied in goods that are exported minus emissions embodied in goods imported, that actually accounts for around 20% of China's total emissions. Total domestic emissions. So this is obviously a major challenge. Fossil energy is one of the primary culprits behind the deteriorating air quality in many of China's urban centers. In Beijing, you probably all have heard, the air quality index, which measures the concentration of harmful fine particles in the air, is routinely above 300 micrograms per cubic meter, and at times has topped 750. So this is over 20 times the allowable standard in the United States and compares unfavorably to much of the rest of the world. Addressing poor air quality, of course, has prompted China's leaders to focus on improving the air quality, cleaning up the energy mix as part of the government's central energy plans. The government has declared a war on air pollution. And the challenge, however, I would argue, is enormous. Despite a lot of talk, a lot of intention, it remains to be seen if the nation can move away from its large, still very large, available coal resource, and if it can find clean, economically viable ways to use it. So just briefly, I'm more of an expert on the Chinese energy system than I am on Latin American energy systems, but since we are here in Sao Paulo, I think it's very interesting to take stock of some of the contrast between the Brazilian energy system and China's. So for example, in electricity generation, Brazil's energy or electricity mix is very different. So coal is only 2% of Brazil's electricity mix compared to 80% in China. And Brazil is overall very clean. So modern renewables account for about 40% of Brazil's total energy demand, with the largest contributions coming from hydro and biomass. China, this contribution is about 1% by comparison, and most of this is coming from solar and wind. Now, looking forward, Brazil is expected to consolidate a position of leadership in global deep water oil production over the next several decades. Brazil looks set to become a leader in low-carbon energy, as well as potentially one of the largest producers of oil worldwide. So we can start to think a little bit more deeply about the differences and the complementarities in the energy mixes of these two countries, and it raises questions about how the two nations might develop linkages going forward, and helps us to consider how their negotiating positions could align or not ahead of major upcoming global climate change negotiations set to take place in Paris in 2015. Ahead of this meeting, there are already hopes that a global agreement for post-2020 action to address climate change could come to fruition, and these discussions are already underway. It's impossible, of course, to say at this point what each nation will do, and China hasn't announced its commitments to date, but we can say that today in China, China's leaders have strong incentives domestically to take action on, to clean up the energy system, mainly to address local air pollution, and this will have co-benefits for reducing CO2 and other greenhouse gases and addressing climate change. Now, if we look at the synergies between the two countries, of course, China's low-carbon path will be different from Brazil's in some distinct ways. In China, it's likely to be wind, solar, and nuclear rather than hydropower and biomass that are so important in the Brazilian context. And I think it's important to think through carefully where the opportunities might lie. As was pointed out this morning, there are significant constraints on agricultural land in China. Growing biofuels using some of those same technologies may have more limited applications in the Chinese context, but there may be other areas around renewables, solar and wind, where China is the low-cost leader in production of these technologies. There may be some opportunities there to see these sources also increase in Brazil's energy system. Now, interestingly, in our work, we've performed an energy outlook for China, if you will. Looking forward, it seems that the source of future energy demand that is least sensitive to any of the proposed actions or policies is really the expected growth in refined oil, in petroleum products. And this is because China will continue to need oil to power the growing fleet of private cars and business vehicles, while at the same time, in Brazil, the IEA expects that Brazil may be producing more than double its domestic level of demand for oil products in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe. So this highlights just one potential area for future partnership, for future discussion. It won't just be in the area of clean energy, but also around conventional energy as well. So just in closing, I'd like to say a couple of words about the fact that MIT has developed very close research collaborations with many Chinese universities and with partners at Tsinghua University in Beijing. It's one of China's top technical universities, and we're really interested also in broadening that to develop linkages in Brazil and more broadly in Latin America going forward to better understand some of the energy challenges and potential synergies, opportunities in energy and sustainability. I'm certainly happy to talk more about some of the work that we've done, as well as how energy and climate policy initiatives and management responses are taking place and shaping the future of China's energy system today. So thank you very much.
I'll just make three really brief points. The first one is that when you come to a conference like that, you always learn new things, and I learned a lot of things about Latin America. Let me single out one thing that I thought was extremely interesting. In the HSBC presentation by Andre, there's a statistic that Mexico's manufactured exports share is about 72% of the Mexico's total exports, whereas every other country on the table, the ratio is almost the opposite, right? 60% is raw materials and commodities. I think there's a saying in Mexico, too far from the God and too close to the United States. It doesn't seem to me that to be close to the United States is such a bad deal. And I think one of the things that China has done right is its ability to develop manufacturing capabilities and the scale of manufacturing. Manufacturing, I think, has a virtue that oil production, natural resource production doesn't have. So I think it's really, really important for policymakers in Latin America to pay attention to manufacturing. The second point I want to make is that the first panel and the second panel today, I saw an interesting contrast between the two panels. In the first panel, there's a lot of discussion on macroeconomic issues, budget deficit, and how some governments have used the windfall gains from commodity exports to finance future savings and things like that. Whereas in the second panel, there's not much discussion about macro issues in China. A lot of the discussion is on the micro side, TFP, institutional reforms, banking institution and things like that. I just want to ask a question whether or not there ought to be more discussion about the macro issues in China. Because if you look at yes, it is true that the government there doesn't run huge budget deficit, but the financial system there works in close coordination with the fiscal channel, right? So there's a financial channel, there's a fiscal channel, and a lot of local governments actually have issued debt guarantees. So there could be a scenario where you have a lot of contingent liabilities that we don't know about, or because there's not a lot of transparency, and we don't really know what the true level of the debt is. So I just want to raise this issue that we should think about that. The third point I want to make is that, and to some extent this is also a contrast between the first panel and the second panel, I think it's because in Brazil there's going to be an election very soon, so a lot of your comments were about politics, and other panelists were also talking about politics. In China, one thing we don't worry about is the political uncertainty, just in a sort of technical sense, right? So we don't have competitive elections. In fact, there's a picture of Mao and other Chinese leaders lining up to cast votes. And the sequence of the lineup, Mao first, and then another person, the third person, the fourth person, the sequence of these four leaders casting the vote is exactly the same sequence of the outcome of the vote. So it's quite a very precise prediction of the election results. That will put the big data forecast in the United States to shame. But I wonder, though, whether or not there is a change in Chinese political system. I don't know how many people in Latin America have followed what is going on in China. The new president of China is really determined to root out corruption. He has a strategy which is known as catching both tigers and the flies. So he has caught a lot of flies. He has also caught quite a few tigers. And one of the tigers is a former standing committee member of the Politburo, and one of the 9 most powerful leaders in China. So that really is a new political game. So what will be the political complexity coming from such a strong effort to go after corruption? I think the old formula has been maintaining the unity at the top level, political unity at the top level, tolerate some corruption, and then the corruption got out of the hand, but tolerate corruption as a way to motivate the leaders to experiment with reforms, right? Opening up and all these things. And then promote fast growth, right? So that has been the tried and successful formula for the last 30 years. Now it's going to be a new formula, zero tolerance of corruption. Anti-corruption touches not just flies, but also most powerful politicians. And then the new normal about growth rate. Maybe the growth rate is going to be lower than before. So I think it's going to be a new scenario. How exactly that scenario is going to work out, I don't know, but it is very important to specify that there are some new elements coming into play, and there's going to be more uncertainty about how all of this is going to work out. I mean, this is on top of the structural changes in the economy, the urbanization, and not to mention the complexities in the foreign policy environment, right? The South China Sea, the relationship between China and Japan, relationship between US and China, just 2 weeks ago, there was a plane, US spy plane, coming close to Chinese territory, and Chinese fighter jet went up very close to the plane. And I just think that it is very important for business leaders, for everybody, to be aware of many, many uncertainties that may arise down the road.
Okay, so I feel triply at home at this conference. It's clearly an MIT family, and I notice MIT students, Marco from the 70s, and Gustavo from the 80s, and Luis and Andre and others from the last decade, so very much at home in that way. Latin America has been important throughout my career, although Brazil has been a relatively infrequent place for me. Andre gave me a nice spin on that at lunch. I've been visiting the runners, not the walkers. Also, when I watched the panel of the 4 Chinese professors, I've been working with Tsinghua and Fudan and Lingnan since the early 1990s in our relationship, helping build their MBA programs and their faculty. So again, it felt very much like family. I can't really reflect on the panel that I will be chairing because it happens next, and I don't want to steal all of its thunder, but I would like to take a few minutes to kind of build a bridge between the morning and what we're coming up with in the afternoon. So very clearly, trade between Latin America and China is overwhelmingly important, and it will continue to grow. Investment is still tiny relative to trade, although it's going to grow quickly. And I think it's going to be very important. In terms of thinking about the impact of China and the changes in China and overall growth rates in China and Latin America, one of the key points I saw today is being clear about which Latin America we're talking about. Are we talking about Australia? Are we talking about New Zealand, right? Australia, commodity producer, New Zealand, food chain, or Mexico, an integrated manufacturer? And Latin America mixes all three, and maybe a fourth, which is Chile, which is a service exporter, LATAM Airlines, shipping, etc. And each of those different Latin Americas has a very different relationship to China. And most Latin American countries embody more than one of those. So I think the first thing is, yes, Latin America is going to lose the very special window on the commodity boom, but the other 3 Latin Americas may be coming into a very interesting period with China. So it's going to be critical. Now, we need to change verbs then, because the morning discussion was largely a macro discussion. It was a discussion about 2 large sets of economies, and the words were interrelation, interdependence. When we talk about investment, the word is engagement. What kind of engagement will there be between China and Latin America? How will they interpenetrate? And the relationship and the engagement are both about comparative advantage, but comparative advantage in engagement is much finer grained. It's about differences in niches. It's about differences in expertise. I also was struck by Andre's slide on the convergence of labor costs between China and Mexico. I think Latin America, and certainly is the case in the US, we still have an image of China as a factor cost competitor, not as China as an expertise competitor. But China is expert in infrastructure. China is expert in cost-based manufacturing. And Latin America is expert in a number of things. So when you start thinking about the knowledge and the expertise as the basis for the engagement, I think it becomes much more interesting. The Latin American environment, I think, again, is somewhat unique. Certainly if we think of the energy sector, but many other sectors. Latin America is a large sector. It's economically important. But when you think about China coming and engaging with Latin America, it's not engaging with the US, where there's going to be a very difficult rivalry for the next decade. It's not engaging with Europe, with the well-established firms. It's coming to relatively neutral territory, but it's neutral territory that's very different than it was 10 or 15 years ago, because the Latin American firms themselves are strong. So it's a continent with local firms that are strong, where the Europeans, the Japanese, and the Americans are all deeply present, as well as the Chinese. That's unique. So China in North America for the next decade is going to be a story of tensions. China and Europe, I don't know quite what the story is. China and Latin America, it's a very different place. It could have some very dynamic outcomes. They could be negative, or they could be positive. I can think of lots of ways it could go either way. But it's important to China, obviously, as a source of commodities, as a market, as an interesting place for engagement, as a place to use some of those surpluses. But China is also clearly important to Latin America. Again, as a competitor, as a customer, perhaps as a complementer. If you change the focus to knowledge-based, expertise-based comparative advantage, just from cost-based comparative advantage, then it has some very interesting implications about how each side has to deal with the other. So Latin America, I would argue, is going to have to do a much better job of letting Chinese firms in. Now, Chile, of course, is very open, and the Chinese firms are quite present in the energy sector. Brazil is much less open. The Chinese firms are still largely coming in through official channels, although there's direct private investment as well. Mexico is quite open. I think China should be paying much more attention to Mexico as the platform to the United States. But if we think of the infrastructure terrain, for example, or the large-scale energy terrain, China is going to have to come on the basis of its expertise and not on the basis of a full turnkey EPC package. So that's going to be a different way for China to operate. I see Charles is shaking his head. We'll have a good discussion in the next panel. I don't think Latin America is going to accept a package deal because Latin America has some fairly advanced enterprises and technologies itself. So if I would go off on the energy side, for example, Mexico is just opening up. Brazil is going to establish itself as a deep water center. How does it engage China? I guess I'd strongly suggest that Latin America take a look at Norway. I was recently at a conference on resource nationalism, and I found the word was very badly used because it was largely a discussion about Venezuela and Argentina versus the others. But the most resource nationalist country in the world is Norway. It extracts a higher proportion of petroleum rents than anyone else. It's superbly resource nationalist. It is also open. It also encourages innovation within Norway. Could Brazil become even more resource nationalist in terms of capturing rents, but being open, but making sure that this is a dynamic innovation and industrial center within energy? That's treating the sector very differently than it has in the past. I also think it's very important for Latin America's development that the Chinese firms engage with local entrepreneurial ecologies. And perhaps that's happening well, but that needs to happen for the inclusion and development in Latin America. And one of the places where I think China could make a big difference, but where the engagement with China could go either very well or very poorly, China's superb at infrastructure. The negative story is China helps Latin America build its international infrastructure, but allows Latin America to continue to ignore its domestic infrastructure. Latin America will then move back to the 19th century and will operate its ports with the rest of the world. Or China, because it's superb at connecting everything within China, could help Latin America connect its domestic food supply chains and other supply chains and manufacturing supply chains as part of the world. So you could see a very good outcome or a very bad outcome of using China's expertise on infrastructure. And that's going to depend on how Latin America engages China. It's going to depend very much on the policies on the Latin American side. I think China is going to have to become more welcoming to Latin American firms. Latin American firms have some strong comparative advantages. They are very good service firms. They are very good at providing integrated product solutions in many cases. So if you look in the transport sector, right, I look at Latam Airlines, Sloan and TAM, as they brag, they have the efficiency of Singapore and they have a Latin American face. That would be quite relevant in a Chinese context. There are a number of firms here who are world-class in very particular ways. And they need to be led in and encouraged. And the Chinese cannot use the defense of, we're a developing country, we don't want to be overwhelmed by foreign firms. That defense is wrong with respect to a Latin American firm. It might be right, it might have been right with respect to a US firm or a Japanese firm. So I think that could be a special entree point for Latin American firms. I would like to see them get more engaged. They are good at the consumption sector. They are good at serving customers. They're good at they're good in financial services. CDB that needs to learn how to become a private equity player, right, and other things, needs to come here to Brazil. That is, what, 20 years ahead in those forms of financing. So there's a lot of room for mutual engagement, taking advantage of more micro-level comparative advantages that allows companies from each country to participate in the other's economy, but which will need, I think, a lot of facilitation in, I love the way macroeconomists talk about all of enterprise, the supply side. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, all four of you. So to our audience, you know, you have 4 MIT Sloan professors up here. We're not asking you to apply for admissions to Sloan. Here's your chance to engage. Yes, but please do. Here's your chance to engage them. So I hope you will take advantage of asking some questions. And for those of you who are former students of some of these professors, here's your chance to take a shot. We have one right. Do we have the mics? Well, you know what we'll do? We'll do this. Here.
Yeah, Professor Valerie, China Daily published an article of mine several years ago, before the Olympics, when the Beijing stopped half of its fleet because of the pollution. That was 1.6 million cars, because there were a total of 3.2 million cars. Today, there's 5.5 million cars in Beijing. So the pollution is much worse. And my article at China Daily at the time said, and recently, just a few months ago, was published by the United Nations, and it says, you know, China's solution is the electric vehicle. But, you know, you can't change 100 million cars. So Brazil, for the last 44 years, has been a champion of bioenergy. All the cars in Brazil can run 100% on ethanol, which is non-polluting. It's renewable. And Brazil, although China, like you said, does not have the land or the water resources in order to produce sugarcane for ethanol, and sugarcane for ethanol is about 40% of the price of corn ethanol, because corn ethanol uses energy to produce energy, and sugarcane, you just burn the waste, and that produces energy. So all the sugarcane and the ethanol factories here sell 3 products. The third is electricity to the local grid. Now, one kind of, you know, partnership could be to transport concentrated sugarcane juice to China, add labor in China, and there you can produce sugar or ethanol or citric acid and other biotechnological products. And that way, China would be using the vast land resources Brazil has, the water resources Brazil has, although recently we're going through a drought, and of course, the fabulous Brazilian technology developed when Brazil was too poor to pay for the import of petroleum, and it developed its local biofuel industry. So maybe we could do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess I'd like to start, I guess, with to put the contribution from vehicles in the context of the air pollution problem. So vehicles are certainly part of the local contributor to pollution in many of China's urban centers, and this will grow going forward. But it's far from the only contributor. There's huge debate over exactly what share of the PM 2.5 in many of these cities comes from transportation. I've heard 10%, I've heard 15%, I've heard in the 20 to 30% range, and of course it depends on which species you consider and a number of sort of technical considerations. But I think the point is that it's not all about cars. The air pollution problem in China is equally, if not more so, about industry, inefficient industry, particularly in the Jing-Jin-Ji region. So Hebei, which had been becoming more and more energy and intensive in its industrial sector, has now started to reverse that trend. But a lot of the emissions that were coming from those factories in Hebei, which surrounds Beijing and Tianjin and contributes significantly to the air quality problem, have started to be shut down. To some of that equipment has at least the most polluting equipment has been sort of targeted for phase out. So that's starting to make progress. It does mean that the province of Hebei is not growing very fast. It's lagging the national average considerably. But this is part of what the region has agreed is sort of one area to target, and it's making an important contribution. Now, it's not to say vehicles are still an important part of the question. The issue, though, is whether you use vehicles running on 100% biofuels or whether you use electric vehicles, you still have to start with the introduction of fuel-compatible vehicles. So it's going to be very difficult to go back to those 5 million vehicles in Beijing and convert them to run on ethanol. Now, going forward, of course, you're saying there's maybe a huge opportunity to use ethanol. Do you have a clarification? Well, I think there are a number of challenges. You may be correct in that it's certainly less expensive to convert these vehicles, but there is the challenge of actually organizing that process. There's also the challenge of mandating biofuels in vehicles. It does require changes to the existing fleet, and that is not trivial. Going forward, of course, there may be opportunities here, but I would submit that if you started to push China more onto a biofuels-heavy path, it would put strains on land use, which would also put pressure on a country like Brazil's ability to meet commitments to reducing deforestation under global climate agreements. So I think it's a question of scales. We need to figure out sort of on what scale does this make sense, and what impact could those measures truly have in a situation as complex as the air quality problems in many of China's urban centers. So I would say there's a whole system to be considered in the context of that particular potential solution.
You can also retrofit a Toyota taxi with front wheel electric motors for less than $1,000. The product is in the market.
That's true, yep.
Microphone, Roberto.
Yeah, I just think that it's good that we think of ideas of how to solve this. So I want to encourage to continue thinking about ideas, whatever it is. I actually think that the problem of the environment is that we have to think in a very macro aspect, which is what Valerie is doing in some sense, is thinking about all the possible connections, and I think that's very important. But clearly the status quo is unsustainable. So starting to change some of the cars right away to be electrical, please do so. Put a humongous tax on gasoline, please do so. I mean, we need to start doing something. If we wait until they find the perfect solution for China, well, we will be dead, and therefore, it will be very simple to find a solution. So in the sense of the environment, I think that countries are very underprepared for many things. I think that countries are not investing enough in thinking about how to solve the issue. That's from the technical point of view. But also, I think that our infrastructure is not very well prepared to manage climate change. So if we think that part of the damage that we have done is permanent, we should be investing tremendously in changing our infrastructure to take into account the fact that storms are going to be deeper, that summers are going to be hotter, and that winters are going to be colder. And for example, a country that is extraordinarily underprepared to manage climate change is the United States. We have invested absolutely nothing whatsoever on the infrastructure to manage climate change and tremendous volatility on that. We still drive cars, and everybody goes on an airplane. I don't know if you have ever tried to land in Chicago in the winter, but that is actually an act of God.
If I could connect this discussion with some of the comments that Yasheng was making, and it's the impact of politics on these issues. So there's politics of pollution. I think, Valerie, as you're noting, in Chile, there's issues of certain segments of the population resisting new energy sources. You have the election here in Brazil. So clearly, for the issues that we've been talking about today, in terms of macroeconomics, in terms of pollution, in terms of micro markets, Don, politics makes a difference. Can you comment? Any of you want to comment on that?
I actually think politics here is potentially favorable. I mean, you think about environmental controls, right? So there's price mechanism, and trading of the carbon quotas and things like that. But there's also command and control method. And so Valerie's own research has shown that for some type of firms in China, command and control can at least work in the absence of other mechanisms. So I wonder, Charles, so if one country can require every single car owner to pay $100 or even $1,000 to make that conversion, if a country that can require every couple just to produce one child, I would imagine that country is able to do that, right? So, so I think the issue here is that I don't know whether China is going to be becoming a democratic country or not, as Brazil did in 1988. It seems that most countries, after they have achieved certain economic development level, they transition to democracy. But I think it will be nice for China, before it becomes democracy, to use whatever power it has to do these command and control things. And I actually think that it can be done in China, but it may not be able, it cannot be done elsewhere, but it may be done in China. Government there is just so powerful. Yeah.
Do we have the microphone down here? I think we're taking some of the thunder from panel 4, Don. I'm sorry. There you go.
I never meant that this ethanol would be the solution to all of China's pollution. I think it could help. But in Brazil, there was, the government politics started this program. And then, of course, today, there is no official help, and all of the ethanol companies are in great difficulty. So I think that if you put the right economic incentives, there is already mandated in 6 provinces in China a certain percentage, I think 5% ethanol mix into the gasoline, but they don't have the ethanol, and the corn ethanol they produce is very expensive. So, and it does compete. It doesn't really compete with the food chain in Brazil. China has 120 million hectares of agricultural land, and it's being reduced. Brazil today uses about 80 million hectares, has 200 million hectares for its cattle, for grazing, and there's about 140 million more hectares of agricultural land, taking away all the environmentally protected areas that is empty and can be used for production, agricultural production. So that is not the big issue in Brazil. However, there would be a win-win situation for both countries. And China could develop the 3rd wave of economic growth and job creation with a 3rd clean energy industry, after the wind and the solar. So that's basically what I wanted to comment. Thanks.
Okay. We have a question up in the back. Oh, well, we have one here, and then the mic will be coming around to you. So,
Okay, so just complementing Mr. Tang's comments, just more regarding cultural behaviors in China. How will be China government dealing with the sustainable policies on public services, e-waste management, and as well educating population on sustainable behaviors, clean consumptions. When you see that Chinese population is increasing consumption power massively, how you are dealing with the population consuming a lot of electronics and whatever, also cars and whatever, and how could we share best practice between China, Latin America, culturally and also institutionally?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a really important area where the two parts of the world could really put their heads together. This is, in looking at China, there's huge rural to urban migration. There's also efforts focused explicitly on urbanization. This will come with anticipated increases in consumption as China's economic structure shifts. And so there's a real question about how this urbanization happens. So how energy intensive will it be? Of course, people will consume more fuel, more electricity, but will they do so, at a twofold their previous consumption or tenfold? And this is an area where China's MOHURD, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, through partnerships with US, Europe, other countries, is really trying to roll out a number of programs to think about how to urbanize sustainably. And this is an area, of course, I think where MIT has a significant amount of expertise as well. This is, I think this is a big important challenge. And to the extent that some of these trends are really important in Latin America today, there's immense room to share best practices. I think, if you look at Chinese consumers, and this kind of goes to your cultural aspect of your question, the Chinese consumer 20, 30 years ago was probably one of the world's most, if not the most, energy or least energy intensive globally. And there is a real culture out of necessity around reusing waste and so forth. And this has changed with the younger generation growing up in an era of relative abundance to some extent. So there are efforts on the ground in China to try to influence this behavior through targeted campaigns and education. And so I'm more familiar with that in China. I'm sure that Brazil and other Latin American countries have quite a lot of expertise in this area as well. So do you want to add to that?
I just want to ask, isn't it the case that agriculture is also a heavy use of energy, right? So water and fertilizer. And China is actually not the best country to produce so much food, right? It's the population density and all of that. And yet the government insists on food self-sufficiency, and they don't trust the international market in food. So yes, the rural migrant labor leaving to go into the city, they consume more energy and all of that, but they also are giving up on a method of the production that is actually very energy intensive. So it's a matter of whether or not you trust the international market.
This is a nice macro-micro link, right? Because Charles, you started the point, but exports from Brazil of biofuels, more food imports, the macro rebalancing possibilities between the continents are very interesting. At the micro level, it's the word engagement, right? Brazil is, in terms of the variety of fuels, very advanced. Chile is a fascinating place in terms of solar and wind. Mexico is probably the example of the world of cleaning up a major city quickly. There's a lot to be learned, a lot to be engaged with between China and Latin America. And of course, we at MIT would love to be in the middle of that conversation.
Of course. I think we had the microphone back here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Andre Martini. I work for Promon, and I'm a former student of Professor Rigobon. But my question is for Professor Lessard. I would like to come back to your point about the other Latin Americas in relation to China. What's the role of Africa as a potential competitor of Latin America as a partner of China?
I left that one out. It makes the world too complicated. But Latin America, as Australia, right, has to worry about Africa in the near term. Africa also will become much more integrated into the industrial economy. It's becoming so very quickly. So it will increase competition. I don't think it's the same kind of total game changer as the rise of China was. So Africa will come up, it will become more of a global player, but a great deal of what it produces it will use. Africa will become a much better place to live, and I think we will all be happier.
Let me say a couple of things. First, I am amazed you survived my class. So I knew there was one student in Brazil, so I found you finally. So
well, you must have taught him everything because he didn't ask you a question.
Yeah, I know. So that's why I'm going to answer the question he was supposed to ask. But regarding Africa, actually, I am very positive about Africa. I think that they have got their act together, and it's after they have resolved part of their internal conflict. It has been very surprising. I always put a list about what is the growth rate of the countries in the last 15 years. And I do a survey before I show that growth rate, and I put a bunch of countries, and I ask the students to try to rank them, who's growing the fastest, and per capita growth rate, so simple. And I put a bunch of countries. And then I show them the list, and it's quite surprising. On the top 10 countries of growth rate the last 15 years, there are 5 countries from Africa. So top 10. By the way, the fastest growing is not China in those 15 years. It's Angola. So it's quite surprising, the list. So, and I think that this just shows that sometimes one reform can go an incredible way to produce growth or prosperity. In this case, it's not minor in the sense of pacifying a country. It's not a minor thing. It's a major issue. But this just shows how much growth. A little bit of that is happening in Colombia, here in Latin America, that Colombia, by finally finding a solution, or a partial solution, it's not totally solved, but going in the right direction, just produces a constant drive of the economy where other inefficiencies start to disappear. And so that's why, in some sense, I think that Africa will be a very interesting region. I think this is a place where first movers will have a tremendous advantage. I think that both China and Latin America have a very good idea how to serve the poor, because we have been doing that for a long, long time. We have businesses that have actually understood how to serve the poor, how to provide services and goods in a way that the poor are affordable to them. And I think that we can take that expertise to Africa. So that will be a place where I think hard about being that first entrant. And there are very clear problems that they need to be resolved, like health issues and domestic violence issues and many, many, many problems. I mean, Africa has many, many problems to solve. But if you think about it, we actually dealt with some of them in the past, at least in Latin America, that I know for sure, and therefore we can actually use that expertise there. So they like to use in entrepreneurship and this word capabilities. We do have the capability to do that. I never use the word capability because that sounds like baggage. But in this case, I'm going to use it in the proper way.
Did you have something you wanted to add? You had your mic up. I actually want to pick up on this a second because we talked about sharing expertise and best practices and all. And to quote my favorite band, U2, every generation has the chance to change the world. So if we're true to the MIT Sloan mission statement that we develop principled, innovative leaders who change the world, what can education do for the discussion we're having today? And especially here we have 4 faculty members from MIT. What can MIT do to impact these issues that we're talking about?
The former dean.
The former dean.
The former dean, yeah.
The former dean, and then the current dean. Well, education is obviously at the center of all of these. But let's think about probably 3 different groups of, so Vittoria talked about, K K through high school being critical. We obviously work in the university sector. University sector is very important and we love it, but it's probably not the biggest problem. The sector that was not discussed so much is the vocational sector. And there's some sectors in China that are dealing with that extremely well, some sectors in Brazil that deal with that quite well. So it seems to me that really thinking about the balance of education and making sure it's widely there and widely available is absolutely critical. We have had a lot of convergence in terms of the basic costs and in terms of the basic opportunity. We might actually be getting into the golden age of comparative advantage by different capabilities. That would be a very interesting world. We'll still have tough competition, we'll still have tough rivalries, but there will be many more chances for interpenetration, and interpenetration is education and expertise driven.
By the way, I'm in the online education committee that we just formed at MIT, and I think that also presents the technology is also presenting a challenge to us as a university to think about how we are going to provide education in the future. And I think a lot of the questions that are coming from that, a lot of the opportunities that are coming from online education, if we are able to actually do that properly, will affect education elsewhere. So it's not only at MIT, but elsewhere. I actually am doing a big data course right now with, it's a TV producer. And this guy had a fantastic statement about online education that I just want to rephrase. He works in the experimental education department at MIT. And he said that the way we are doing online education is mostly typing someone lecturing in a class, okay? That's more or less how we do it. Or we have a lecture and then we do a video conference and we tweet the answer. And his statement was, have you realized that that's only like 5% of the talent, no? And I said, well, I'm the faculty. I said, well, in your case, it's 2.5. But, but truly, and in fact, what we're doing is actually producing almost like a TV episode with actors that are actually acting. So when I want to highlight, for example, issues of market incompleteness, instead of showing or drawing a board, these guys are creative enough to create a scene that looks exactly like that. So I think that we are challenged to improve education ourselves and to make this available to the world. They did a course, and in my course, there are 60,000 people registered already. This for free. And the idea is, yes, we can change education and we can make education very relevant for others. And I think that this is absolutely the key. The progress and the growth and the standards of living will improve by us educating ourselves. We will improve our impact on the environment, but actually being more educated. But I think that we have a challenge because we faculty, we tend to just stand up in front of a board and, and talk and do it in the traditional way. And I think online education requires a complete different approach to that. And of course, I'm very shy, so they are forcing me to wear costumes and stuff like that. But truly, in the end, it does make a tremendous difference when you can provide a concept in a clear way that is understandable, in a language that is clear for everybody, and therefore you can make a difference. I think that a close friend of mine, let me just say 1 second. A close friend of mine talks about social sciences and the issue that a lot of our social sciences, especially economics, have failed tremendously on what we would like to do. When you think about an applied sciences, we should be, first and foremost, we should be useful. We should be able to construct stories that can resolve disputes and that can resolve issues in the real world. And to construct those stories that are convincing, you need 3 elements. First, they have to be based on sound theories. Second, they have to be, hopefully, data relevant. And third, they have to be transmitted in a language that can be understood by everybody. In economics, we severely fail the third one. I mean, we rarely speak the language that normal humankind speak. So when a central banker says quantitative easing, no one has a clue of what that means except they're easing some quantity, okay? And the natural rate of unemployment, surprisingly, has very little to do with the rate of unemployment. It has to do with changes in wages. So we speak a horrible language that nobody understands. Second, reality for us is almost like a particular case that is not that relevant, okay? So when we develop a theory and doesn't work in reality, we say, well, there's a puzzle and there's a data, doesn't work because my theories will never be wrong. And we have become a theory-based profession, which makes us very useless in particular. And I think a little bit of management, online will present that challenge, where online management education has to be completely different, and it's going to break what we are accustomed to do, what we're comfortable, where everything that happens in our classes will be actually totally public, and we're going to show what we do. And I think that requires a change on both. So if we want to change the world through education, I think online is a process, and we will have to revise how we actually provide that service.
So one of the ways, I'll give a very micro example. One of the ways in which I currently, and I guess for the past 3 years, in the context of our collaboration with China, have been working towards this high-level impact that MIT and Sloan and educational initiatives are really meant to have, I think, is in the way that we have developed a kind of integrated team that includes participants from both Chinese universities as well as here at MIT, sitting side by side and developing tools that can support management and policy decisions. And we spend quite a bit of effort thinking about this issue that Roberto mentions, which is so important, communication. So how do we stand in front of a group of policymakers in China, try to help them understand the trade-offs and the policy decisions that are being made that inevitably affect industry in the areas of whether it be clean fuels, electricity, end-use energy management. We're trying to operate at the forefront, and we do so by actually sitting down side by side and building models and doing projects together. So combining tools developed over many decades at MIT and bringing students with deep knowledge of China's energy system into the same room for long periods of time, sometimes 6 months or a year, to try to develop these types of analysis that ultimately I think will have impact on policy, because the answer was developed jointly by an international team that includes many members who are deeply connected within the Chinese policy community. So this is a sort of micro example of one of the ways that our work has significant impact on energy decision-making in China.
Yes. So if you think about a university as an enterprise, and then think about how this particular enterprise, educational enterprise, contributes to society and economy. Traditionally, it has done it in 2 ways. One is that it is training human capital, right? Some of them are sitting here. They were Roberto's students and Don's students. Apparently, none of my students showed up. So I consider that as a personal failure. Yeah. And so that's one way. And the other is that a research enterprise such as MIT produces knowledge. There's no question that engineers and scientists at MIT are producing world-class knowledge. A lot of it can be converted to knowledge that is useful for enterprises, for economic growth and development. As we know very well that MIT affiliated companies jointly create, 11th largest GDP in the world. Roberto touched on the question about social science. A lot of it, has, there's a question, whether or not that kind of research has at least immediate usefulness for society and for the economy. But that's, there's a well-established tradition of respecting scholarly independence and all of that, and I think we shouldn't mess with that system. But I wonder if there's a third way, and that way has to do with how we use, in our case, the business school, how we use our MBA students immediately to benefit and to be useful to entrepreneurs in Brazil, entrepreneurs in Argentina, entrepreneurs in Africa, entrepreneurs in China and India. the people that we educate, they are not going to work for these small and medium entrepreneurs after they graduate. They go and work for McKinsey, they go and work for Goldman Sachs. But we have 2 years when they are students at MIT Sloan School. And some of my students formerly worked for McKinsey. They charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to their clients. After they graduate, they get job offers from McKinsey. They charge even more, right? It's exactly the same people, right? Their human capital has not deteriorated, at least under Roberto's teaching. They may have deteriorated under my teaching, but they have not deteriorated at MIT Sloan School. So we have figured out how to use these people to directly benefit small and medium entrepreneurs. And just to provide some information, every year in a course co-taught by myself and Simon Johnson, it's called Global Entrepreneurship Class, we send about 40 teams. Half of them come to Latin America, half of them go to Asia to work with small and medium entrepreneurs to provide business solutions. Increasingly, we got projects from Brazil, projects from Latin America about how to get into China, right? Very interesting projects. A Brazilian company tries to sell stuff to China. They have no idea how. Charles and I were talking about this. The lack of expertise in Brazil about China is really disproportional to the level of trade and investment between China and Brazil, right? So we provided these services practically free of charge. Our students get a lot of benefits from this. This is called action learning. We think about action learning as a viable challenge to a business school case study method. We also have China lab, we have India lab. So we really, I mean, for the audience here, we really welcome your participation and support of action learning at MIT Sloan School.
Great, thank you. We had a question in the back. And then we'll come over here. We have the mic, and do we have sound on the mic? There you go.
Hello, my name is Tadeu. I was also a student at MIT with Roberto, and we had some chats also. And I was in your conferences
all
too.
yours are online.
Yeah. Actually, I've been to one of your conferences at MIT, and it was also interesting to see your thoughts. And actually, my question goes to you, since you've been doing this kind of exercise with people from all over the world, looking at China and Latin America in the labs. Here in Latin America, we are very close, like Brazil and the other countries, but yet we are too far. There is a lot of cultural differences between the countries, and we've been together for the last 500 years, or more or less some civilization organized here in this region, and yet we are very far. When we try to do business with the other countries, it's still very difficult. And the gap between us and China is ridiculous. It's super far, and we have a lot of trade, but we heard this morning that it's very important to have more trade and more investment. And those two things, they go through the same funnel of relationship. Either you trade or invest by having deals. And there is this huge cultural gap. And from your perspective, when you look at your students, what would you say that should be the points where we should focus on doing when we try to do business between Latin America and China to overcome this gap?
I think that's an excellent question. For China Lab, for example, we have had Brazilian students participating in China Lab. They work hand in hand with Chinese students. These are all MBA students, so not undergraduate students, so they have substantial business development experience. The average age is 27, 28. So they have the kind of maturity and professionalism, and they have also motivations and goals that are aligned with their activities. They work hand in hand with Chinese students and form a very deep relationship with them. When I started China Lab in 2008, I thought cross-cultural communication and teamwork is a big pain in the what's the polite way? Big pain in the shoulder, whatever, neck. Yeah. So, and it's big pain in the neck. The huge surprise to me was the students would tell me, Professor, your lectures about China, whatever, they're kind of interesting, but not that interesting. It's really my, working with Chinese students that's really, really interesting. I gain insight about how Chinese society works and how Chinese enterprises work. I have had a number of students, I don't remember if they were Brazilian or not. I have had a number of students, as a result of doing this, have decided to form entrepreneurial enterprises with the Chinese students they work with in China. I have had students who got job offers from the client companies that they work with. These are local companies. These are not multinational corporations, right? So without this kind of vehicle, there's no way our students are able to interface with purely local Brazilian companies, purely local Indian companies, and purely local Chinese companies. I would say that the cultural barrier is the greatest when our students work in China because of the language difficulties. Brazil, Portuguese, but most of the, I think, people in the business community speak English. So the barrier is not as substantial. And I have to say that in the second panel this morning, we have had Chinese professors from Tsinghua University, Fudan University, Lingnan University. These are our partners, or in communist country we call comrades. They are our comrades, and comrades even in arms. And we work closely with them. Without them, there's absolutely no way we can tap so deeply into Chinese economy and Chinese society. Because of their help, we solicit projects that are purely local. Because my own thinking is that if you accept a project from Microsoft in Beijing, the nature of the project is not going to be that different from a Microsoft project in Seattle. Whereas accepting a local project from a local company in Beijing or Shanghai is going to be qualitatively different from a project working with IBM. We have also had a very close relationship with Yunnan University. Yunnan University is located in a province, not surprisingly, called Yunnan, which has the second lowest GDP per capita in China. We don't want to just go to richest part of China. We want to go to one of the poorest regions of China. Students come back and say they have learned so much because they have seen both the richest part of China and the poorest part of China. I can claim, without blushing, even though I may have blushed, without blushing, that MIT Sloan is a leader in this area. Thanks to leadership of Dong, thanks to the unfailing support of Roberto and a lot of my future support of Valerie, it's really, and also Stu and David. It's really, our whole school is behind this enterprise. We feel very proud of it.
And this is experience-based thing, so it's always how do you get the first time. So the first engagement makes the next engagement much more likely. I'm involved in a parallel, slightly different lab, the Go Lab, with our mid-career students, Global Organization Lab. And there we actually work on problems of established companies, but we insist they be in at least 2 locations, and one location be a strange location. And the students have to dig into that, but they have to worry about engineering the relationships across. And these are people who are 38 years old. So they've already had typically some touching local places, but it's part of the same, and it's not that they get this total education in working across cultures. It's that they get engaged in it and they start, it's that first step. It's learning by doing, and you've got to do the first time.
Please don't forget the sustainability lab.
And the sustainability. Notice we have nice competition about the labs, but this is really good. We have the S lab and the G lab and blah, blah, and the Go lab. But this is actually becoming the key feature in the educational program.
we were planning to create the macro lab, so we send people to Venezuela to practice really bad policies, but somehow they decided that we're going to call it the Argentina-Venezuelan lab, and from now on we're going to experiment every idiotic policy in these places.
And you want to randomize the country.
And we're going to randomize and do everything that is actually wrong in the world. We're going to try it there first as a teaching lesson for everyone in the world.
This is the countries that suck lab.
Well, the treatment is wrong, but the methodology is correct. Right?
We're nothing if not innovative. We had a question here.
Hi, I'm Alejandro Sinkiewicz, MBA class of 2003. We've been talking about education, so I have a childishly simple question. What should we be doing as parents to encourage our kids learn Mandarin Chinese, and as society members to encourage our governments run some initiative so that our kids learn Mandarin Chinese, which will be increasingly important?
Great question.
So, are you Brazilian? Okay. So, I think, it's really, I have been to Brazil a number of times, and the first time was 2005. So they told me then, I've never been to Argentina. In fact, 10 years ago, I applied for a visa to go to Argentina. I was denied a visa on the suspicion that I have tendency to migrate.
Suspicion that you were Chinese. Yeah.
Well, no. And they got that fact right, but they think I want to migrate to Argentina. Yeah, so I don't know how they were able to
Actually, it was me.
Okay. So, but my friends in Brazil told me in 2005, this is almost 10 years ago, that there are not many professors who can teach Chinese in Brazil. I just had a conversation with Charles just now. I asked him, are there professors and teachers who teach Chinese in Brazil? His answer is no. 9 years after the explosion of trade and investment, there has not been sufficient investment in cultural and language familiarity with not just with China, maybe with Asia as a whole. To me, this is remarkable, and I don't know what the bottleneck is. It just seems that the case is so obvious. In the United States now, even primary schools, some of the primary schools, begin to teach Chinese now in their primary school curriculum. I think this is a little bit overkill, but
let me explain the story of my daughter.
Okay.
So actually, well, my daughter, she's 20 years old. She's super smart, super beautiful, very kind person. So clearly she's not mine, but that's a minor point. And she was born totally bilingual because at home we speak Spanish and English. So she kind of learned very early the importance of languages. And not surprisingly, the two languages that she picked when she was going through high school, one of them was Portuguese. And actually, she has spent time here. She's a student at MIT in the material science department. And she spent last summer here at MIT, at Fortaleza, teaching five graders about how to do science. And her idea is that she wants to change the way we teach science and engineering to primary school. And of course, she has to be totally fluent in Portuguese. And in fact, her teacher says that she's absolutely fluent in Portuguese. And she has spent 5 years learning Chinese. So when she was given the option about what languages she wanted, the languages were Portuguese and Chinese. And now, Chinese, for us Latin American is, is Chinese. So it's kind of a, it's a little bit more complicated than Portuguese and Spanish. So, so you see, for us, learning Portuguese, it took her 1.5 years or 2 years, and she became not fluent, but that it was working. So she could communicate after 2 years of intense
this is
learning.
In the United States.
And she's in the United States, yeah. But so my point is, I think the kids, given the opportunity, and I think that what we have to do is to create the opportunities. If you have no teachers of Chinese, the opportunity doesn't exist. It's impossible to even think about that possibility. But if you create the opportunity, I think that our kids are extraordinarily smart. and they realize what the options are. And when there's, you know, a significant proportion of the world speaks Chinese when you put all of them together, and that's about, you know, a third of the world speaks something that sounds like Chinese, you will make the investment, and they will make the investment. But if you don't present them with the opportunity, it's almost impossible to assume to force them to go it. And in that sense, I think that that's the wrong approach. I will not force them. I will present them with the opportunities. But then you have to do the investments. You have to change the education system in such a way that you present them with that chance. And now there are some things that I think that they should be compulsory, like learning English, and so some things that are more basic. So, but these we need to present.
I can just add a few words to that because I learned Mandarin relatively late in life. And I think that the most important thing when you're learning languages when you're young is to be really excited about it, to understand the culture that's intimately connected to the language. And so I learned German when I was in high school. And this was helped immensely by the fact that there was a whole community of people who also were interested, were excited about doing Stammtisch, which is, you know, kind of a community exchange around a table at a local bakery, German bakery. You know, this kind of thing can, so I think recognizing the important connection between culture and language and introducing kids to sort of the cultural elements of Chinese, even if they're not getting formal language training, can be a huge way of motivating them later on to seek out opportunities to more deeply study and learn what they need to. I think, you know, sink or swim, you know, even post-college can help you. You can get a long way with just that, even if I think even if you haven't had an opportunity to study the language earlier. So I think it's just really about creating that excitement early on.
I have a very practical suggestion, right? So you should talk to Argentine government or Brazilians talking to the Brazilian government. Chinese government has a program setting up this thing called Confucius Institute that teaches Chinese. They are going to pay for everything, right? So it doesn't even require, you know, the Argentine government or Brazilian government to pay for it. You should ask your government to talk to the Chinese government about establishing Confucius Institutes in Brazil and in Argentina. I think they are. Okay. In Argentina as well?
In Brazil.
Well,
right.
But I think it takes a while to learn Chinese from Argentina to Brazil, yeah. So.
Just to wrap up my comment, as a parent, that's the easy task, I guess. But as a society, I believe that there's no awareness that we should run initiatives to have our children learn Chinese, which is, I believe, is really important.
Well, hopefully this conference starts to do that. We've talked about building trust. So we have one more minute. I have one more question. We've talked about exchange, best practices, and everything. When I was recently in China, I had a person say to me, you know, we really want to host the World Cup, and we really want to make it into a qualifying round. But, you know, we're the second most populated country in the world, and we can't find 11 guys who can play football. Latin America seems to be pretty good at it. Well, not recently, but most years. What lessons can be learned? What lessons can China learn from Latin America?
You're asking a Venezuelan. We have never qualified for the World Cup. So
you've got Argentinian blood, Roberto.
My advice to the Chinese will be not be a Venezuelan. Everybody else qualifies for the World Cup except us. And so we have never, ever qualified to the World Cup. So actually, I'm the wrong person to say it.
But you do get to have the last word.
Yeah, so I have to, as one of the faculty's directors in this program, I will not, unfortunately, will not be able to say goodbye at the end, and I wanted to take at least 1 minute to do this today. We have to go to the airport. So this conference is our first conference, and we're learning a lot from this, and we probably will learn much more from the second one. We believe that the Latin America and China regions are very important, so we're going to continue trying to foster this for the future. But these conferences do not take place randomly, or they don't occur like a random act. We require sponsors, and I want to thank all the sponsors that made this possible. I want to thank all the speakers that so graciously decided to come and share their time and their wisdom with all of us. So absolutely all of them for the tremendous commitment to MIT and to this endeavor. I want to thank Stu and David and Julie Strong for their tremendous leadership in creating this. And I I never forget people, don't worry. But more importantly, this doesn't happen without people like Sandone and Angie, which actually they have absolutely not spent a single second sleeping the last 6 months. Sandone used to look like Brad Pitt before this started. He still is good looking, but you know, you can see the trend going. So I just want to thank them and recognize them publicly, because without you guys, this would have never happened. Of course, as faculty directors, we provided the leadership and the moral inspiration. So therefore, we deserve 95% of the credit, but the other 5 goes to them. Thank you so much for doing this and all their tremendous work. Thank you so much for everything.
Okay, and so thank you to our panelists. This has been a true treat as we thought it would be. So thank you. We're going to take a short break, and then we come back and we've already had a preview of panel 4. Thank you.